Hello, my name is Peter Camardo, and this is my Senior Challenge presentation. It's titled Student Government Reform. So I'll start off today with a quote from Thomas Jefferson, and that is, "There has never been, nor will ever be, a people who are politically ignorant and free." So what is Senior Challenge? Senior Challenge is a program at South Burlington offered to seniors through the Career Development Center. And so basically it's a capstone experience where students spend 45 hours of work working on a project and a research paper. And so I'll be talking about both of those things today. And so the subject for my Senior Challenge came from my experience in student council and my interest in government, which also came from my experience at Boys State last summer. So what I'll be doing for my research today, I'll be looking at three major topics: student government, political efficacy, and voting and voter turnout. And at the end of my research, I will evaluate the U.S. democracy today based on the 5 core principles of a traditional democracy. And these come from Robert Dahl's traditional democratic theory. And so these are equality in voting, effective participation, enlightened understanding, inclusion, and citizen control of the agenda. And so for my project, basically what I did is I restructured the student government process at South Burlington High School. And so my objectives in doing that were to educate student council members on United States government processes, to create a streamlined method to communicate students' ideas with the administration, to plan student activities, and to promote leadership and democracy. So the first step in my project was to create a set of student council bylaws, because bylaws are essential for any group to have, and there previously were not bylaws in the student council. And so I did research through the website at Purdue University and based my student council bylaws on Purdue University Faculty Senate's bylaws. And so what I found is that there are 5 core things that bylaws must contain. So that's the official name of a group, the purpose, and then the group structure, policies, and procedures. And so a lot of my time in constructing these bylaws was spent on developing the group procedures. And so how I was able to develop these procedures, like I said, I modeled them on the Purdue Faculty Senate. And then I also knew a lot of student council functions from my previous 3 years on the student council, so I was able to develop these bylaws through my experience and through my research. And so then I also developed one new bylaw that I called the student government bylaw, and so that's where my real project comes into play. So what the student government system looked like before was a system called Student Forum. And so once a year, members of the student council from each class would hold a discussion with members from their class that was open for anyone to come to. So there'd be 4 discussions. And so then after the discussion of the student council members, the student council members would come together and form a committee and discuss ideas that each class had brought up. And so then that committee would narrow down all the ideas that came to them and select a few top ideas that they thought were more important than all the others, and then bring those to the administration. And so there were a few problems that I found with the student forum system. The first was that there was low participation from students. So you would go to a class discussion and there would be maybe 5 or 6 students from each class that were giving ideas, and so it wasn't really representative of everyone in the school. Another issue was that it was only once a year, so that the student council couldn't deal with issues as they came up throughout the year. And then issues also were not being brought to the administration effectively because there was no outlined method for narrowing down the proposals, and it was a less organized process. And so then another problem that I identified within the student council is that there was no government aspect. So students who wanted to join the student council because of their interest in government did not have that opportunity at South Burlington. So what I did is I created this restructured student government system, and I based it on the U.S. Congress policymaking procedure. However, it is an abbreviated policymaking procedure to fit the needs of a student council rather than a formal government. And so already in the student council there existed 4 representatives and 3 officers from each class. So that's 12 officers and 16 representatives total. So it was easy for me to split up the student council into 2 branches of Congress. So I made the Student House of Representatives, and the officers became the Student Senate. And so how the policymaking procedure works is that students or student council members can propose legislation, and then it's brought up in the student council and it's discussed in the student council just as it would be discussed in committee in the U.S. government system. And so then once discussion closes on the bill, it's then split into the 2 separate chambers for a vote, and if it passes in both of the chambers, then it's brought to the administration. And so this resolved the issues that existed in student forum. And then a key part of this is that it included a redrafting process. So if a student created a bill and then it was proposed to the administration and the administration added some new information that maybe wasn't available to the student before, they could recommend a redraft, and so it would go back to the council where then they could reform the bill knowing the new information. And so this procedure was introduced to the school's administration in a presentation in January. So how students get involved in the system now that it was put in place, I created a website for the student government, and so on the website there's an introductory video, and there are also instructions for submitting a bill template, current bills being processed by the student council, and also bills that have been worked on in the past. So that was more of the project side of my senior challenge, and so now I'll be getting into the research that went behind the project. And so like I said, there are three main topics that I'll focus on in the following order. So that's political efficacy, and I'll look at more of the causes of recent trends rather than looking at what is political efficacy. And then I'll go into voting and voter turnout, and I'll finish up with student government. So what is political efficacy? Political efficacy is a sense of feeling important in government and feeling like your voice matters. And so this can be shown through voting, supporting campaigns, or running for local office. And so a few measures that experts use for measuring political efficacy are voter turnout, government approval ratings, and trust in government ratings. And so recent trends in political efficacy show that it's declining, and especially with youth, and so that's what I'll focus on. So I'll look at a few causes for why these recent trends in political efficacy might be happening. And so the first is the lifestyle of today's youth. And so policy is not as directly affecting today's youth as it was of generations of the past. And this is because young adults have a tendency to stay at home for longer in their life, meaning that they're not under the financial support of their parents, and so they're not being as affected by policies as directly as previous generations. And so a few causes for young adults staying at home for longer periods of time are rising housing costs, rising youth unemployment, rising costs of higher education, and fewer available jobs for adults without college degrees. So another big effect on political efficacy is media, and I'll go into a few types of media here. The first is broadcast media. So broadcast media includes radio, television, and the internet. And so it's a very popular style of media because it's fast and relatively inexpensive to get information out to the masses. And so there's a major effect of media on political efficacy caused by what I call a diversity of options. And so what I mean is there are many different channels you can watch, many different websites you can go to, and things like that, radio stations you can listen to. And so what this creates is an opportunity for ignorance. So generations of the past, when a president was speaking on TV, that was what people watched because it was really the only option to watch on TV. But today you see when a president's speaking on TV, you can simply change the channel to sports or entertainment or something that youths find more interesting, and so that's what they have a tendency to do, so they're becoming more politically ignorant. The other effect is called the narrowcasting effect, which happens within news channels. So news channels tend to have a certain bias towards either the left or the right, and so individuals will watch the news stations that agree with their stance on political issues, whether they're conservative or liberal. And so what happens is when you watch a liberal newscast and you have liberal beliefs, then your beliefs become solidified and you get more liberal. And so that's called polarization. And so what happens is the two parties are becoming more and more polarized, and so this makes Congress difficult to get through with legislation. Another part of media is what is reported, and so like I said, there's a heavy bias in news. And so part of the reason for this is that news channels are competing corporations trying to get the most money, and by trying to get the most money they need the most viewers, and so to attract viewers they're reporting news that maybe isn't the best for people but is more interesting to people and draws people's eyes, and so they may stretch news or come up with news that maybe isn't that important but it sounds good to people. And so when you do get politics on TV, what you see are like 10-second sound bites, they're called, of a politician talking, and then it'll usually be a talking head up there analyzing what the politician is saying. And so that's not good because it creates more of a bias rather than letting the viewer make an interpretation of the politician for themselves. So today's modern media, a lot of people believe it is caused by the Watergate scandal, which happened in 1972 when the Nixon administration was caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee's headquarters. And then the administration attempted to cover up the whole scandal. And so what happened then was the Washington Post followed them closely, and because of the event, the Washington Post got a lot of new followers, and so people were interested in that style of media. And so gradually this is how the media has kind of developed from rather just reporting politics to now searching for government corruption. And so there are two stances on this new style of modern media. The first is that it focuses on issues that are unimportant, and it discourages the best candidates from running for office. The other is that it protects against government corruption, and it makes sure that the candidates who do end up in office have a clean record and are honest people. And then the final media effect that I'll look at are negative ads. And so negative ads cause distrust and cynicism within the citizens. And so who it actually affects most are the people who are non-partisans, because they don't like to see negative ads. If they don't lean towards one candidate, it discourages them towards the candidate who's receiving the negative ad because they don't like what the ad is reporting. And then it also discourages them from the candidate who promotes the negative ad because they don't think that's fair politics. And so what you see is that more nonpartisan and middle groups are dropping out, which means that more people are polarizing, and so the parties actually end up with more power through negative ads. And then the last effect on political efficacy I'll look at today is centralized power. And so most of this information comes from The Power Elite by C. Wright Mills. And so what he argues is that there are three major institutions that dominate America today. And these are major political institutions, major corporations, and major military institutions. And so what he argues is that there is an elite group of people at the top of each of these institutions that make decisions regarding everyone involved. And so as society has progressed, these institutions have become larger and larger in our lives, and they become more centralized, meaning that the decisions made in political institutions are now affecting military institutions and also the economy. And so now there are a smaller elite group of people that are making bigger decisions and having to deal with fewer consequences. And so then this elite group is less representative of the whole. So to just sum up what I've talked about political efficacy, there are two real explanations for the trends, and that's the separation of people in government and cynical and apathetic views towards government. And so the separation is caused by the elite making decisions and policies not directly affecting citizens. And then the apathetic views are caused by the mass media style of media and negative campaign ads. So the second part of my research was voting and voter turnout. So for this section, I'll be focusing on presidential elections because there's more data on presidential elections than other elections, and it's easy to keep consistent through all my research. And so voting is the most basic form of political participation, and it shows a strong sense of political efficacy. So the research topics I'll look at in this section will be the presidential election process, the Electoral College, and then I'll do a statistical analysis of the Electoral College, voter turnout trends, commonly accepted explanation for these trends, and then something I call the paradox of young and minority voters. So to run for president, you must be 35 years of age, you must be a 14-year U.S. resident, and then you also must be a natural-born citizen. And then to make it to the general election, you have to first pass the primary election, which is where the two major United States parties nominate a singular candidate for president. And then in the primary elections, candidates have a tendency to lead further to one side to try and stand out from other candidates from their party, while when the candidates who are nominated for the general election run, they lean closer to the middle on policies to try and draw viewers from either side. And so how the president is actually elected is not a majority vote. It's through a system called the Electoral College. And so there are 538 votes for president, and you need 270 to win the election. And so there's one vote for every member of Congress plus 3 votes for the District of Columbia. And so most states are a winner-take-all system, meaning that the electors in that state have to vote for the candidate who wins a majority of the vote. And so some of these electors are required by state law to do this, and some are it's just understood that they will vote for the candidate who wins the majority. And so specifically in Vermont, there's a state law that says you have to vote for the candidate who wins the majority. So now I'll do a statistical analysis on the Electoral College. And so one major criticism of it is that it gives a lot of power to the swing states, which means that states that tend to be more fluctuant in their voting receive a lot of media attention and political attention because politicians aren't sure which way they're going to vote. So in states like Vermont, where not only do we have not many electoral votes, but historically we're known to vote with either one side or the other. And so we get very little media and politician attention. And so then there are four major criteria for evaluating voting methods. And so these are majority, Condorcet, and monotonicity, and independent of irrelevant criterion. So I'll explain each of those four now. So what the majority criterion is if candidate A wins a majority of the vote, candidate A should win the election. The Condorcet criterion states that if candidate A is preferred by the voters over each of the other candidate in a head-to-head competition, candidate A should win. The monotonicity criterion states that if candidate A wins an election and in a re-election there are only changes that benefit candidate A, then candidate A should win re-election. And then the independent of irrelevant alternatives criterion states that if candidate A wins the election and upon a recount one of the non-winning candidates withdraws, then candidate A should still be the winner of the election. And so these voting methods tend to focus on a recount or a re-election. And so if a candidate is removed, how would the voter preferences change and how would that change the outcome of the election? And so the Arrow's impossibility theorem states that not one voting method can satisfy all four of these criterion 100% of the time. However, the majority criterion is the simplest of the four, and there have been 3 times out of all the elections, presidential elections in the history, in which the majority criterion has been violated because of the Electoral College. And so that means that a president who actually won majority of the votes did not win the presidency. And this puts the president in a difficult position because of a theory called the mandate theory of elections. So what the mandate theory of elections is basically when you're elected to office, it's assumed that you have a majority of the votes, meaning that a majority of the voters support you and your policies, and therefore you have the mandate of the people to move forward with your policies. But if you don't have that majority of the people, then and you move forward with your policies, you could be criticized by over half of the voting population. But at the same time, if you don't move forward with the policies, you could be criticized for not moving forward. And so it puts the president in a difficult position. So now I'll go into some voter turnout statistics. This graph comes from the current population survey, which is distributed by the U.S. Department of Commerce. And so there are a few major trends you can see here. The first is that with the exception of senior citizens, all of the age groups have tended to decline over time as far as voter turnout. And then the other major trend is that the younger people are, the less they're tending to vote. And you can see that there are generally low rates for all population. And so there are a few commonly accepted explanations for why voter turnout is the way it is and how it's looking in the future. And so the first is barriers to registration. And so this is expected to decrease the number of voter turnouts because it's hard for people to register. However, the Voter Registration Act of 1993 made it possible for people to register when they get their 18-year-old license. And so it was pretty easy for people to register, and more people were registering. However, the percentage of 18-year-olds voting didn't change much, so this theory has been discounted, and people don't think it is as much of an impact as they once thought. And so then there's also an increasing number of young adults in our society today, and since young adults statistically show up to vote the least, that's expected to decrease the percentage. There's a rising education level in our country, which is expected to increase because education level is an indicator of someone who would vote. And then a decline in social connectedness through church and family is expected to decrease the voter turnout. And then so the paradox of political participation is expected to decrease the voter turnout. And so what the paradox of political participation is it's a relationship between young adult and minority voters, politicians campaigning, and then policies that are made on behalf of those politicians. And so what happens is young adults are statistically the people to show up to vote the least. And so when a politician runs for office, what they'll do is they'll do research on who their voters are, and they'll campaign towards the voters and try to promote policies that appeal to the people who would vote for them. And so what happens is when these candidates are elected to office, they proceed with the policies that they campaigned on. And so then the policies that go into action are actually policies that are affecting the voting population. And since the young adults aren't voting as much, then the policies don't affect them as much, and they show up to vote less. And so this starts the cycle all over again, and it causes young people to stay out of politics. So I've covered political efficacy in voting, and now I'll go into student council a little bit. A student council exists to plan school activities that promote school spirit and community, to act as a liaison between the student body and the administration, and act as an extracurricular activity for students who are interested in learning about or practicing the government process. And like I said earlier, the first step to creating a successful student council is to have a set of bylaws that contain the official name, purpose of group, and then the group structure, policies, and procedures. So focusing on the liaison from students to the administration, I've designed 4 criteria that a method should have in doing this. And so what these criteria are is that ideas can be processed in a timely manner by the student council so that the council can respond to urgent issues. Ideas can be processed throughout the year so problems can be prevented or stopped in their developing phases. Each student council member should have an opportunity to offer his or her opinion on the idea before it is brought to the administration. Ideas should be refined in a well thought out manner, especially regarding finances, by the student council to ensure credibility when presenting to the administration. And so the other aspect of student council that's important is to provide a mock government opportunity for students who are interested in pursuing a career in public service. And so it's also important to practice leadership and thorough thought when designing policy for the school, and then also to practice official meeting procedure through Robert's Rules. So now I'll sum up the 3 ideas that I've just researched. And so looking back at Robert Dahl's traditional democratic theory, we have equality in voting, effective participation, enlightened understanding, inclusion, and citizen control of the agenda. And so I'll go through each one of those and kind of evaluate how the U.S. is doing. And so in equality in voting, we see in the history of the Electoral College there have been violations of the majority criterion, meaning that there isn't necessarily a full equality in voting. Effective participation, we see declining political efficacy and declining voter turnout, which show that our participation is declining. Enlightened understanding, because of irrelevant news coverage and negative news coverage, we see that people aren't as knowledgeable as they once were. And then inclusion, through the paradox of political participation, we see that the voting population is less representative, and candidates who move forward are less representative of the whole population. So not all of the voting age population is included. And then citizen control of the agenda, similar to the paradox of political participation. The citizens who are controlling the agenda are not representative of the whole population. So I'll leave with a final question, and that's, are student council and enlightened voting understanding the solution to political efficacy trends? And so I think that important to reversing these political efficacy trends is ending the paradox of young and minority voters, because that will continue to keep young people out of politics. And so one way I think that we could start to end this paradox is to restructure the presidential election process and to look at the Electoral College and say if it's really something that's valuable in our society today or if it's something that's obsolete. And then also encouraging the groups who don't typically show up to vote. And I think that could be done by a candidate who appeals to these non-voters and appeals to policies that are important to them. And then I think around student government, if we place an emphasis on student government and student voice in schools, this will give students a sense of educational efficacy and make them feel like they have a voice in their education and their classes and what they're doing in the classroom. And I think that later on in life that'll develop into a sense of political efficacy and feeling like they matter in their community and country. And so I don't think these 2 alone will be a solution to getting more understanding of politics throughout the country, but I think that they'd be a step in the right direction. And so I have further research recommendations, a reflection, and a complete bibliography in the student council, in the South Burlington Community Library. And so here's my bibliography. And so mentor and self-evaluation, I had Mrs. McDowell, who is the student council advisor this year, do an evaluation on 9 main criteria from a 1 to 5 scale, and I was awarded all 5s by her. And then I also, in the beginning of the year, when I was structuring the process, I received input from Helen Head, who is the Vermont House of Representatives representative from South Burlington, Vermont. And so, then on a self-evaluation, I evaluated myself on the same scale. And so I found my strengths to be working with little supervision and being professional. And then my challenges to be finishing assignments within a specified time frame. So I'd like to thank a few people, Nancy Lavarnway, who's my senior challenge teacher and the Career Development Center gatekeeper. And so she got me to do the senior challenge, and she helped me through each step of the process, and so thank you. Kimberly McDowell, who's my senior challenge mentor, she was the student council faculty advisor this year, and so she helped me implement the process. Helen Head helped me create the process and made sure that everything made sense as far as modeling after the U.S. government. The SBHS administration for allowing me to do this and take on this project, and then my peers on the student council for understanding the process and being flexible in adapting it.